like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. There are going to be allusions to and mentions of sexual violence and transphobic hate crimes. If that's not something you feel like you can listen to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this episode. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is the You Look Like a Badger podcast, a monthly podcast where I discuss queer cinema. It is officially May, and in May, we are gay and we do crimes. So the theme for this month are queer crime movies, and the pick that I have decided to go with regarding controversial / possibly offensive cinema is probably one of the most famous and well-respected films of all time, The Silence of the Lambs.
Well, I've read the case files, have you? Everything you need to find him is right there in those pages.
And tell me how.
First, principles, Clarice. Simplicity. Read Marcus Aurelius. Of each particular thing, ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature? What does he do, this man you seek?
He kills women.
No, that is incidental. What is the first and principal thing he does? What needs does he serve by killing?
Anger. Social acceptance and sexual frustrations.
No, he covets. That is his nature. And how do we begin to covet, Clarice? Do we seek out things to covet? Make an effort to answer now.
No. We just...
No, we begin by coveting what we see every day. Don't you feel eyes moving over your body, Clarice? And don't your eyes seek out the things you want?
The Silence of the Lambs is a 1991 mystery crime thriller directed by Jonathan Demme and starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. It follows Clarice Starling, played by Foster, as she uses the help of infamous cannibal killer Hannibal Lecter to unravel the mystery behind the Buffalo Bill serial killings, psychologically torturing her in the process. The film is both a damning condemnation of misogyny and objectification and an offensive rehash of transphobic tropes about serial killers, making its legacy both very impressive and hard to reconcile with. In my opinion, this film is nothing without its transphobia, which is why enjoying it as much as I do is very conflicting. This film, because it's so famous and well respected, won so many awards, probably the most significant. It did like a sweep at the Academy Awards and won the Big Five, which included both Hopkins and Foster for Best Acting. But some others I will mention. It won Best Film by the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures, CHI Awards and PEO Awards. Demme won the Silver Bear for Best Director at the 41st Berlin International Film Festival, and this is among many others. On Rotten Tomatoes, both the critics and audience score are 95%, and on Letterboxd it has a 4.3. Pretty much undeniably well respected, very good. But the thing about films that are well respected and very good is that people are quite defensive when you have very legitimate criticisms about it. This episode's going to be fun. Before we get into that, I would like to read some of the most popular reviews, and in these reviews' defense, the ones that are at the top, a lot of them were like, wow, this is aged kind of poorly, but oh my god, I'm so I'm so scared. A lot of this podcast is going to be, wow, this was done very well, but also, oh my god, what have we done to trans people? Here are some of the most popular reviews on Letterboxd. This first one is from Issy. They did like a meme scenario, which is always really funny to try and convey in audio form. The first line of dialogue is Hannibal Lecter, and he says, I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti. The next line of dialogue is Gordon Ramsay. Gordon Ramsay, he says, delicious, finally some good fucking food. That is currently the top review on Letterboxd. So I think it is good that some of the most popular reviews on Letterboxd are from trans people. So I've got two of them here. They're coming at the film from two like opposite ends of the spectrum. So the first one is from Sally Jane Black, who writes, "A film that embraces the medical community's distorted transphobic view of trans women, this film is viscerally uncomfortable in certain parts. It accurately depicts how trans women were treated when they didn't pass, weren't pretty enough, didn't play the right game. No matter how much you enjoy the artistry of this, it won't change the fact that this is a violently transphobic movie, and it won't change the fact that it's glorifying an institution responsible for more death and destruction and hatred than any serial killer ever." I agree, without a doubt, and I think a lot of culture is kind of coming to terms with the kind of legacy of bigotry and how a lot of the best art still includes that. And I think that is probably what this episode is going to end up being. But before we get that, I have this last review. It's from Willow McClay. He says, "Very obviously not transphobic due to the well-known fact that trans women hate bugs." So that is where we're ending that. I just wanted something a bit more light before we get into the episode. But here is where I'm going to give my spoiler warning. Now, The Silence of the Lambs is one of the most famous American films of all time. So there is a chance that this episode won't actually make a dent because you already know so much about it. But I have probably spoiled some of it in actually reading these reviews, in that it's not a secret what the deal is with Buffalo Bill and that character. But still, if you don't want details, everyone knows what a spoiler warning is. I don't know why I'm dragging this out. But if any more details than this would ruin the experience for you, you don't want the mystery to be revealed, you don't want plot details to be known to you, I would really recommend watching the movie. Or if you don't feel like sitting through it for some weird reason, you could always just go on Wikipedia and read the plot synopsis, so that you are spoiling the film for yourself. You're taking back the power and you're not leaving that in my hands, so that when you come back to this episode, when I start talking about plot details, they'll make sense to you and it won't feel like I've ruined a movie experience for you because you already ruined it for yourself. This is just spoiler warning. If you don't want spoilers, leave now.
Do you know why he's called Buffalo Bill? Please tell me. The newspapers won't say.
Well, it started as a bad joke in Kansas City homicide. They said, "This one likes to skin his humps."
This is going to be like slightly different because in order to talk about the LGBT representation and themes, I need to set up what the film is trying to do and how that kind of informs the later stuff. So what I'd like to talk about first is objectification and the way this informs the depiction of the police. So the way that this film is shot is very specific, and many people have sort of gone over it. There's so many video essays on this film about the way point of view shots are used in the film, and it's very famous for kind of inverting the gaze, because instead of the camera simply looking at characters, we have characters, mostly male characters, looking directly into the camera, and our subjective point of view character is Clarice. So we have this kind of dichotomy of Clarice Starling, who is a female member of the FBI. She's like a student, she's studying, she wants to go into behavioral sciences, and she's kind of thrown into this serial killing case. And we have this kind of twisted juxtaposition of the way that Clarice is kind of gawked at by her colleagues and the way that she is kind of bored into by Hannibal Lecter, where he fully sees all her bullshit and he's not buying it. So it's this kind of dichotomy of every man in this film is a dick except Hannibal Lecter, who is trying to psychologically destroy her. And we have this kind of fucked up idea of being like seen and being dissected by a very fucked up man, and having that be preferable to the treatment she's getting from the people who are meant to be her colleagues. It's being looked at like as an object and being seen, like truly seen as a person. And it frames it in that we're invited as an audience member to simply look at Clarice or to try and understand her. And I think in doing that, it is, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's kind of revolutionary because it's asking us to look at the ways that we are complicit in not only Clarice's objectification, but the objectification of the victims in the film. I'm going to read this excerpt from a Vanity Fair article about Jonathan Demme's directing style, and it says, "The Silence of the Lambs is the story of a woman succeeding in a man's world, of having to fend off advances, mask her emotions, placate her superiors, and minimize femininity and sexuality to rise. Though the camera itself never objectifies Starling, it relentlessly tracks the leering head turns of many men who do, so we feel her objectification to a claustrophobic degree." I would argue that whilst yes, Clarice is an interesting character, that this kind of theme that is conveyed through the camera work does more to set up Hannibal than it does Clarice. So it works more in his favour. And I don't think that it's a stretch to argue that Hannibal is the more interesting character, probably the most interesting character in the film, bar Buffalo Bill himself. What this does is it sets up Hannibal as Clarice's only safety net. And because Hannibal is kind of a terrible person, this is really terrifying, actually. So we see that during their first meeting, Hannibal is quite dismissive of Clarice. He kind of dresses her down when she seems like she has an agenda and only agrees to talk to her after he sees that she's been sexually assaulted. Not because it's a specifically gendered crime or that is towards some kind of sense of justice. He seems to view it as a rude kind of violation of the etiquette that was the relationship. Like, he's quite happy to be rude directly to her to her face, but because he doesn't really have control of his environment, he's trapped in a box. He views the actions of Miggs, who is the one who sexually assaults her, as a violation of the agreement that was made when Clarice stepped in front of him. You know, she agreed to meet the famous serial killer. She did not agree to have semen thrown on her, you know? So this violation breaks this kind of social contract, and Miggs is punished for this. He is talked into suicide. I'm going over this in such detail because I think the film establishes that Hannibal's crimes are not sexual. So whilst he does mention sexual violence on several occasions, he very specifically doesn't condone it. He has like an etiquette to the way that he's willing to talk. And he is presented as like a gentleman, which, you know, there are holes in this. So he doesn't tolerate any kind of sexual violence aimed at Clarice, but he's quite happy to sexually harass the senator towards the end of the film. So it is kind of person-based or dependent on the situation. I think Hannibal works to convince Clarice that he is the only person that she can trust. And that's kind of the psychological element to their relationship. And I think the film works to set this up because he has to be a direct dichotomy to Bill, obviously, but also to the police, who are consistently framed as incompetent, one step behind, misogynistic, indifferent, blasé about the work they do, and generally non-effective. So the film is asking us to distrust everyone except Hannibal. Like, even to an extent, we distrust Clarice because, you know, she lies as part of her job. She is complicit in certain amounts of police work. She's in the FBI, so we, by definition, know that they are covert and secretive, and Hannibal is kind of the character that's taking a scalpel to all of that and peeling it all back. It's only through Hannibal that we know about Clarice's childhood. It's kind of forced out of her. What I'm getting at is Hannibal is set up as a beacon of truth I suppose is the word I'm looking for. He is the no-holds-bar bullshit detector who is gonna outsmart you and just wade through all the bullshit. Clarice kind of needs that, which is something that the film makes quite clear, because police work is framed as very objectifying. So we see the way that at a funeral, in a funeral home, during an autopsy of a dead woman who was very brutally murdered and skinned, there are just like 30 police just stood around, and there's a dead body in the room, and Clarice has to ask them to leave because they have to do a job that is quite upsetting and brutal, where Clarice is very visibly upset whilst it's happening. And there's a moment where they're all like gathered around watching the TV, and they see the senator kind of begging the killer to let Catherine go, right? And we see her like repeatedly saying Catherine's name, and they're showing pictures of her. And I think it's Casey Lemon's character who says, wow, that's like really smart. And then Clarice says if they keep saying her name and they show pictures of her, then they're kind of asking the killer to see Catherine as a person and not as an object, because then it's a lot harder to cut her up. This is like directly after the autopsy that they've done on another girl. So it feels as though Clarice is reflecting on her role in objectifying this woman, where they've had to take pictures of her dead body and, you know, talk about the damage that's been done and like pull a cocoon out of her mouth. And obviously that's like the oddity of the situation, but it's a situation where, at least in my opinion, Clarice is reflecting on the extent that she is just like a serial killer. So, you know, she's had these interactions with Hannibal, and from a distance, you know, interacting with his victims, she's had interactions with Bill, and she has like numerous interactions with other men on the police force. And she's basically given all these opportunities to look at the ways that she is simply complying with a system that hates women and does not see them as people. So it very much seems like Clarice's goal is to not be like Bill. She also doesn't want to be like Hannibal, or really the other men on the police force, but Bill as a killer is the most grotesque to her, because he is using women's skin and then discarding them. This all kind of culminates in Clarice's story about the screaming lambs. And I'm not going to repeat it in full, but the gist of it is that one night she kind of encounters, whilst living on a ranch, the lambs that are about to be slaughtered are kind of screaming. And this story reflects her mental state at the time, I'd say, but also she's reflecting on the role that she has in the case and the extent that she can't save everyone. Even though that's the job that she wants to be able to do, she gets away with a lamb, but then she's taken right back and the lamb is killed. So it frames patriarchy. In my opinion, it frames kind of patriarchy as relentless and kind of futile railing against, because it's going to get you anyway. The lamb is going to be murdered, and so will you, and you will continue to be objectified when you work in the police force, because it doesn't matter what you do. That's just the system that's in place. And I think the kind of powerlessness is kind of the point. The only kind of question we need to ask is, who is presented as the greatest villain? Who is the one truly victimizing Clarice? And I think that means that we now have to talk about transphobia and Buffalo Bill, because whilst other men in the film are given like weight to their horrific misogyny and violence, Bill is the most memorable, I'd say, probably after Hannibal, and he is the one that we are trained to hate. So let's get into it.
Our belly wants to change too.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Billy is not a real transsexual, but he thinks he is. He tries to be. He's tried to be a lot of things, I expect.
Our Billy wasn't born a criminal, Clarice. He was made one through years of systematic abuse. Billy hates his own identity, you see, and he thinks that makes him a transsexual. But his pathology is 1,000 times more savage and more terrifying.
I think it's good that I spent the first part of the podcast kind of setting up Clarice and what she's dealing with, because as a kind of response to the objectification she experiences, she kind of exists without any kind of sexuality. So she is repeatedly kind of fielding off advances from her colleagues, and she's not said to have any kind of romantic or sexual exploits. It's not important to the story, despite being like pushed onto her constantly. If we were to kind of stop our kind of feminist analysis of the film, that would be kind of the end point. So Clarice is kind of forced to mute her sexuality as a response to a patriarchal environment that is constantly pushing sexuality onto her without her consent. But I think a modern lens that needs to look at the ways that, yes, this film is radical and changed a lot. It needs to look at the ways that it has also been quite harmful. So yes, Clarice is presented without any kind of sexuality, but this is also meant to be in contrast with Bill's kind of perversion. And this is also set up with Hannibal, right? Because Hannibal has a, quote, high-powered perception. He is deductive, he's an intellectual, he's an artist, he's an appreciator of beauty, he's not an appropriator of it. And he very specifically doesn't seem to have any kind of sexuality. He doesn't pursue Clarice as a potential sexual partner. He does mention sexuality every now and again. He asks Clarice if the rancher that she went to go live with sodomized her, which I would, yes, argue is sexual harassment. But that whole interaction, it's meant to set up that men view misogyny as in very like violent terms, right? So if it's not active sexual assault, then it's not anything, right? So in that situation, no, the rancher didn't sexually violate Clarice in any way, but he did deliberately kind of kill the lamb that she was trying to save. So misogyny in the film is kind of front and center, right? I'm not denying that that is a very radical point of view. What is important to look at, though, is the extent that this actually informs the transphobia in the film, because Bill is presented by putting his kind of queerness alongside his very violent murder, torture and murder, and then defamation of a corpse by skinning it to make a woman's suit, is also what the film is trying to be about, you know? So Bill's queerness, I suppose his transness, I am kind of hesitant to use that word, and I'll explain in a second. Bill's kind of transness is presented as an extension of the objectification that I was talking about. It's specifically meant to be the violation and the misogyny in its purest form. So Bill's desire to be a woman and the way that kind of goes about it is meant to be misogyny, right? It's not meant to be this kind of legitimate way of life, right? It's meant to be a delusion and something that he's doing as like symbolic of the harm that he does to women. I am going to talk about why I'm kind of hesitant to call Buffalo Bill trans, and it's not because I want to undermine legitimate analysis that people have done regarding this film, because I think it is fair to look at the ways that this film, whilst probably not meaning to, reinforces ideas about trans people. But the reason why I don't want to refer to Bill as trans is because the film makes such an effort to let you know that he's not a real transsexual. Now, whilst I don't want to like lean into transphobic ideas of what is and is not a real like trans person, I don't also want to talk about this film as if it has anything legitimate to say about trans women, because a lot of it is not intentional, and because it's not intentional, it's really messy and not concrete. So this is a really long way of saying I don't want to, I suppose, legitimize the idea that this is like peak trans representation. It's really messy, you know, because I want to refer to a character the way that the film is, but in doing that, am I kind of being transphobic in that it's important to kind of talk about the more offensive parts of trans history? A lot of cis people wouldn't view Buffalo Bill as a trans character, but that doesn't mean that they haven't internalized ideas about trans people from this film. I am actually going to talk about the conception of the character. I basically don't want to legitimize the transphobia of the film. That's probably not the cleanest way to talk about it, but this is a messy fucking film. So I suppose the analysis of it also has to be messy. Basically, I don't want to be offensive with this. So if I am, then I take responsibility for that. It's a hard film to talk about, I think, because the film doesn't know how to talk about it, and that's part of the problem. I'll get into it. So Ted Levine, who plays Bill, very much interpreted the character as a kind of sick homophobe mocking gay and transgender people and trying on personas via women's skin. That was how he interpreted the character. And in the making of documentary that I watched in preparation for this podcast, he specifically said that he never actually thought of the character as being a legitimate representation. Like, he never thought of it as being gay, and that he would talk to like drag queens or like female impersonators as he refers to them. I'm not quite sure what that means. I don't know if he spoke to actual trans people or just drag queens, but when speaking to them, he got the idea that it was like a completely separate thing, and that the film's interpretation of it is fully detached from the LGBT community, and that, as the film goes out of its way to state, is not trans. I think that you can say that, but at a certain point, you're not in control of the interpretation of that. And whilst I want to respect an actor's process and own interpretation of the character and how they played it, I don't agree with how this came across. I wouldn't say that it's entirely clear that he's homophobic or mocking queer people. There's no kind of subversion there. Beyond the dialogue between Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, where they go out of their way to make this statement about trans people, there's no kind of subversion of that. Like, it really is just a stereotype played quite straightforwardly. I don't know if this interpretation came after there was like an onslaught of criticism towards the film. There is a very large chance that it's kind of retroactive and not what the case actually was. Like, they were accidentally homophobic and transphobic and were like, oh shit, I didn't mean to do that. So they kind of walked it back and was like, no, he was meant to be a homophobe the whole time. Didn't you know? Like, there is a chance that that's the case. I don't think people want to be thought of as bigoted, so they kind of go out of their way to be like, it wasn't. I promise you it wasn't. Ted Levine kind of apologized. I know Jonathan Demme also was kind of sorry about this whole experience. I think when I was watching the making of, it's so kind of clear that this was made by cis straight people who didn't kind of think twice at the kind of villainization of queerness in the film and had no conception of what being trans is, and just wanted to vaguely allude to, we're not talking about real people here, we're just talking about these freaks. You know? I have a quote from that Vanity Fair article, specifically about the protests that were happening at the time. The LGBTQ plus activist group Queer Nation protested the film at the 1992 Oscars, and today there are some who wonder if we should engage with it at all. Karen Tongson, chair and professor of gender and sexuality studies at USC, says that no work is unproblematic, so we have to look at the film in its original historical context. On one level, she says, silence is part of a longer story of how mainstream films were seen to lack real nuance around queer identities and pathologized gender variance. The most insidious thing about this portrayal is that the film doesn't work without the transphobia. We don't understand Clarice's plight until we see this man seeking to appropriate women's experiences and women's victimhood under patriarchy by literally stealing their skin and trying to wear it. I don't want to seem like I'm reaching or trying to imply stuff that wasn't intended, but one thing that I noticed on the last rewatch that I did is the multiple names that Bill goes by. So we have Jamie Gum, John Grant, Jack Gordon. And there's a really cynical part of me, and I am saying this fully aware that the transphobia does not seem to have been intended, but the fact that trans people are often told that once you're born, that's who you are, and you have one set of pronouns and you have one name and you can't go by anything else. The fact that Bill has almost a ridiculous amount of different aliases to kind of convey his duplicity, his secretiveness, and his inability to have a stable identity in a cis-normative world. It feels quite specific to trans people, many of which will have to change their names and often struggle to do that, and have people respect that, to call them by the name that is their actual name and not the dead name that they used to go by. So it feels, whilst, yes, once again, I want to state not intentional, it feels very insidious to have this character have multiple names and that kind of be part of the puzzle or the mystery that is this killer. How he can't ever have one stable identity, he has to go by multiple. How we never learn his quote-unquote real name. And I think there is so much about this film that just is transphobic and homophobic. So again, that's kind of why I'm hesitant to Levine when he said that was intentional, because there isn't any kind of commentary towards it. It just is. So Bill putting on makeup and tucking, he has a nipple piercing, he has a little dog, he's obsessed with aesthetics, he deliberately imitates Catherine when she's screaming in the pit. All of this feels like actively mocking queerness, mocking transness. None of it feels as though it was intentionally trying to subvert anything. It feels as though they were trying to make a comment about misogyny and the way that men under patriarchy are able to usurp any and all kind of power that women have. And the one thing that women have is a stable sense of womanhood and femininity. And Bill coming in and trying to appropriate that is an intense violation, inherently violent and deadly in terms of what the film asks us to believe. I'm quoting this Vanity Fair article quite a lot, but it is very good, so I would read it if you have the time. But I have this last quote from the Vanity Fair article, which says, "The Silence of the Lambs no longer reads as a story of transformation, but of ascent, and how it can be achieved by only a select few. By its closing credits, the white trash deviant is dead, and others have died and risked their lives to ensure a white girl from a good family is safe. Starling achieves a feminist class milestone for herself, and for the moment is spared by Lecter. But when her mentor, Jack Crawford, gives her a lingering handshake, it seems clear that her gender will continue to stand in her way. The gains feel marginal, temporary, and infused with dread, and not just because Lecter is still out there." in a sense, the film has to be re-examined. And I think it very much has. Like I said, the reviews on Letterboxd are like very often acknowledging the transphobia in the film. There is like criticism of trying to do a modern analysis of a very dated film because applying modern sensibilities to the past isn't necessarily fair. And, you know, in that way, I get that. I think that for the most part, this is trying to reflect the 1990s attitude towards queerness. But as I've stated, the people who made the film are very like, we didn't mean that. We were trying to talk about homophobia and we didn't mean it. But I am wary of people who continue to kind of refer to this film as like a feminist masterpiece, particularly when they don't discuss the transphobia. The second thing that I want to talk about in this section is, yes, it is unfair to apply modern sensibilities to a film of the past. However, these films have an impact on culture, and they continue to do so, particularly because The Silence of the Lambs is one of the most well-respected films of all time, right? And for a lot of people, for a very long time, it was actually the only reference point people had for trans people. Like, you can disavow the transphobia till the cows come home, but do you think like a cis person who is aware of trans people in a cursory sense, but they don't know any trans people and they don't know that much about being trans, do you think they're going to be able to distinguish between actual trans people and the depiction here that has been a kind of staple of culture, like mocking cross-dressing and attempting to change one's gender is quite common, particularly right now, actually. Transphobia has ramped the fuck up, which is distressing, but we try to move along. So I'm going to put a clip here from the documentary Disclosure from Jen Richards, mainly because I want to convey to people that films like this have an impact, and Jen talks about her experience with a colleague.
I was about to go through transition, and I worked up the courage to tell one of my colleagues, and she's a very, very smart woman, very, very talented musician, very well educated, very worldly, and she looked at me and she goes, "You mean like Buffalo Bill?" Like, her only point of reference was this disgusting, psychotic serial killer who hunts women in order to kill them and skin them in order to wear their bodies, to literally appropriate the female form, which is exactly like the feminist argument against the existence of trans women, is that we're trying to appropriate the female form. And here he was doing it literally, physically. And, you know, she regrets it now. She looks back and she's horrified that she said that, because she knows trans people now and she knows the issues and she knows me. But the fact that that was her only reference point, that that was her only template for understanding was a sick, psychotic serial killer, it hurts. It just hurts.
Does this film look like a badger? I am saying this with a lot of admiration for what this film was trying to do. This film does, in fact, look like a badger. I think it is very flawed. And it can't kind of be separated from its transphobia. Like, it just can't. The transphobia is part of the film. It's actually what makes the film work in terms of what it's trying to talk about. It has chosen to talk about misogyny using transphobic tropes. And a lot of those tropes have informed the way that people interact with trans people in real life. It's this idea that trans people are duplicitous and that they deserve to be eradicated because of that, because they are inherently trying to deceive people. That can't be separated from the way the film talks about misogyny. I think it's a very good film at depicting objectification and depicting the way that Clarice is complicit with the victimization of women. It is probably very deserving of its accolades, but its progressive ideology has aged out, unfortunately. Is very good at feminism in the 90s and has kind of stays and ends with that, because it has us side with the FBI in these crimes, and its representations of class and gender are very dated. It very much reflects what's being pushed in terms of feminism. It reflects assimilation rather than anything very radical, and very much focuses on the destruction of those who wish to appropriate femininity. Still, should you watch it? I'd say so. I'd say, as a thriller, it's probably one of the best. The editing is excellent, the camera work is excellent, the acting is very, very good. But, a critical eye is essential with these kind of things, so you're not internalizing points of view about trans people. What else should you watch? What are my recommendations? So I mentioned and used a clip from the Disclosure documentary that I think really everyone should watch. So I used it for research purposes, but I'd obviously seen it before that. I think it is an important documentary because you see the impact that representations like this film have had on trans actors, because a lot of the time, I know Ted Levine was playing this character, but a lot of the time trans people have to play the stereotypes that have kind of permeated society, and I think actually seeing the impact that's had on them is very affecting. I also think that having a rundown of the way that queerness and transness has been depicted in American cinema is kind of essential to understanding why people interpret trans people the way that they do. Just excellent documentary, revelatory if you haven't interacted with trans people at all. Also just a really interesting look at kind of film and TV history, if that's something you're interested in. I know I am, so I do have 2 fiction films. They're not documentaries, you don't have to learn a single thing watching them. So we have Knife Plus Heart, which is a murder mystery thriller about a gay porn producer who is trying to keep her production in check as her actors are getting picked off by a mysterious killer. Now this is set in the 70s, so you can imagine there's going to be some commentary on the past, which I think is probably the best way to talk about the past. It's good to make some comments. Not simply depicting it. I think having that kind of analysis of homophobia, it makes for a much more interesting experience. And I think this film is also just really nice to look at as well. So yeah, I'd recommend it. The second film, and this might be controversial, but I'd recommend Cruising. This film was probably as controversial as The Silence of the Lambs is now, but is just less well known. People don't know about the Al Pacino movie that has fisting and bondage in it. I don't know why they don't know about it, but it's a good film. It's about an undercover police officer who is sent into the leather bars to try and track down a killer who is murdering gay men. And during this process, he has a lot of experiences that he would not have had he not been doing undercover work. And I think it's a really interesting film about the politics of working with the police and the kind of visceral impact of homophobic violence. And it is quite graphic, so be wary. But I'd say this film has a really interesting way of presenting queerness, so it is definitely worth the watch. If you are kind of sensitive to homophobia, I'd maybe read some analysis of it first. I know that there were significant protests about this film, and I'm not, undermining that. I think it's more interesting in its homophobia than not, if that makes sense. The Silence of the Lambs has some interesting stuff to say about transphobia, whether it knows it or not. And I'd say that Cruising also does that. So yeah, I'd also recommend Cruising. All right, that is the end. I'd like to thank you for listening. My next episode should be for Pride Month, and I'm going to be looking at documentary for June. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure you follow me on Twitter at @LikeABadgePod. You can follow me on Spotify, subscribe to me on YouTube, and follow on TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you'd like to read more of my work, you can find my writing at ambercamwalk.com. And if you'd like to give me money, then you can donate to my coffee, which I'll put in the description. All the sources that I've used are in the description as well. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you in June. Bye!